Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, the Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Kim and Judy Davis Dean's Lecture, titled Trauma to Transformation, a set of existential opportunities to address environmental justice and the climate crisis. Before I introduce our featured speaker, Mustafa Santiago Ali, I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to Kim and Judy Davis, whose support makes this lecture possible. And I'm very glad that Kim Davis is with us today. I want to say hi to Kim. Again, thank you for your generosity. I also want to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. The mounting climate crisis has cast a spotlight on the relationship between humans and the environment. The effects of increasing temperature and changes in long-term weather patterns, including rising sea levels, extreme storms, droughts, floods, wildfires, and decreasing biodiversity. These threats impact livelihoods, health, and critical infrastructure, yet the cascading consequences of the climate crisis are not borne equally. Around the world, vulnerable and marginalized communities bear a disproportionate burden. This is true at the level of nation states. The global South has contributed the least to the crisis, yet faces some of the most dire consequences. This is also true more locally. A 2021 study by the Environmental Protection Agency found that socially vulnerable communities, particularly communities of color, face elevated risks of the most severe projected climate change impacts here in the United States. The urgency of the climate crisis and the importance of addressing its inequitable effects prompted us here at the Radcliffe Institute to launch the Climate Change Initiative this fall. Today's lecture is a part of that initiative. Our work over the coming years will apply our interdisciplinary lens to advance our understanding of the complex causes and remedies for climate change. And we're committed to providing opportunities like this one today for public engagement with this important set of issues. As we'll hear today, the effects of climate change are not the only way in which environmental harms fall unequally across communities. Environmental risks, such as hazardous waste storage or the presence of toxic materials like lead, have long posed well-documented dangers to human health and well-being. And in this country, harmful environmental exposures are more likely to affect people of color, low-income people, and other underserved communities. For example, studies have found racial and socioeconomic disparities in exposure to fine particulate matter in the air, disparities that have persisted as overall concentrations have declined. Such environmental risks are also thought to intersect with social inequities, creating what the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services describes as, quote, cumulative, disproportionate impact that hinders optimal health and environmental justice for these populations. Now, these inequities are not new. To the contrary, they've been the focus of environmental justice advocates for decades, stretching back in some cases to the civil rights movement. Indeed, there's a long history of community activism, particularly in communities of color, to eliminate environmental disparities and claim a seat at the table in environmental policy and decision-making. These issues, both long-standing and relatively new, demand action. For that reason, we're very fortunate to be joined today by a leader in efforts to advance environmental justice and build a sustainable future, Mustafa Santiago Ali. Mustafa is Executive Vice President for the National Wildlife Federation, Acting Chief of Programs for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and founder and CEO of Revitalization Strategies. He has also served as Senior Vice President of the Hip Hop Caucus, leading its work on climate, environmental justice, and community revitalization. Mustafa spent the first 24 years of his career in the EPA, starting when he was a student. He was a founding member of the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and held numerous roles within the agency, including Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization and Assistant Associate Administrator. A recognized thought leader and community liaison, Mustafa has worked with more than 500 domestic and international communities to advance environmental, health, and economic justice. He's also a prolific public speaker and media commentator, and he co-hosted the Hip Hop Caucus's radio show and podcast titled The Coolest Show, which I have to say is the coolest name. Welcome, Mustafa, to Radcliffe. And just before Mustafa approaches the stage, I do want to say that following his remarks, he'll be joined in conversation by Stephanie LeMenager. Stephanie is the Barbara and Carlisle Moore Professor of English and Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon. Her scholarship focuses on climate change and the humanities, and her work has been featured in the New York Times and other media outlets. Her many publications include the books Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century, and Manifest and Other Destinies. Stephanie also co-directs the Center for Environmental Futures at the University of Oregon, and she was a fellow here at Radcliffe in 2016-2017. Steffi and I were actually in the same fellowship class, and I'm thrilled to welcome her back to campus. After Mustafa and Stephanie's discussion, we'll turn to audience questions. Whether you're watching in person or online, you can submit questions at any time using the Slido link that's provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. And now please join me in warmly welcoming Mustafa Santiago Ali.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I have to take my jacket off already. Let's try it again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I thought I was in Cambridge. You told me it was going to be lit. It's an honor to be here with everyone. Just want to thank everyone who's been on the front lines, who've been out there fighting diligently, whether in the classrooms, those who are researchers, those who are literally on the front lines, for all the young people who still believe that change is possible. And not just believe it, but know it deep down in your soul. And for all of our elders also, who for decades upon decades have been holding it together to make sure that real change happens. Give yourselves a round of applause for all of that you've done. It's okay, you can clap. I was raised in a family on one side of Baptist and Pentecostal ministers, so you might hear some of that come out as we take this journey together today. And I also, in the thousands of presentations that I've given, I always give honor to my mother and my grandmother, who are the rocks that I stand on. By a show of hands, how many folks in the room, and I would love for everybody to look around, like your mother or your grandmother? If you love your mother or your grandmother, raise your hand high. Everybody look around. If you find somebody who doesn't, just go over there and give them a hug. It's going to be all right. You know, we got a lot today to talk about and only a short amount of time to begin this conversation. I was blessed earlier today because I had a chance to have lunch with a number of the amazing students who are part of the school here to hear about their hopes for the future. Also, their sets of concerns, which are very legitimate. The skills that they bring, the ones that they're developing, the ones that were already instilled inside of them, and how they want to utilize those to help make positive change happen, to help make sure that vulnerable communities no longer have to deal with the situations that have been placed upon them. They're thinking about, what does transformation really look like? How do we help people move from trauma to transformation, if you will? So we're going to take a journey. I want to bring forward the faces and spaces that sometimes folks just don't see. Sometimes we turn our head the other way when we drive by certain communities. We have to change that dynamic, and we have an opportunity. So I want to begin our journey because we often talk about the existential threats that are going on. There are also existential opportunities. I'm always reminded of this quote from the great leader Gandhi. Now, Gandhi was not a perfect man, but he also did a lot of good while he was here. And this one always gets me because it says, "Earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greeds." Think about that for a second. In many of the injustices that we've seen inside of our country, how greed played a role in many of the things that we will see. It doesn't get much clearer than when we brought Africans to this country and enslaved them. We enslaved them because of their expertise. We enslaved them because folks felt that they had a right to, sometimes through faith-based beliefs and a number of other dynamics that went on. But greed was one of those. Racism was another part of those. And it also began to set a precedent that we will see play out in our country that has allowed the creation of sacrifice zones, that have allowed the sacrificing of people. And we will also talk about how we move past that. But it wasn't just our African brothers and sisters, also our indigenous brothers and sisters also were removed from their traditional lands, taken away from their traditional foods, and given, in many instances, deadly diseases. All of this we know because of historical records, but also because of policy. Policy justified slavery. Policy justified the genocide that happened to many of our indigenous brothers and sisters. So we have to understand that policy can be a negative that can destroy, or policy can also be used to uplift and to heal. And I wanted to bring forward also because when we talk about environmental injustices, we are talking about the impacts that are happening to African American communities. We're talking about Latinx or Latin communities. We're talking about indigenous brothers and sisters. We are talking about Asian and Pacific Islanders. And we are also talking about lower wealth white communities in many instances. So I wanted to bring forward because sometimes we've forgotten also about these injustices that happened, about how we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. I always think that it's really interesting because the Chinese played such a critical role in the building of our infrastructure, and we now hear people over the last year and a half talking about infrastructure. We've had significant dollars that went in there after our Chinese brothers, and if you also understand the history of our country, also stopped Chinese women from coming into the country, therefore utilizing that to be a reason to actually have the men to go back home. But then after we got done with the work that they did, we began to exclude them. And then I wanted to bring forward also our Japanese brothers and sisters who were placed in those internment camps. In many instances, wealth being stripped. Each of those sets of communities that I highlighted, another dynamic was the disinvestment and also the stripping away of wealth. And wealth is important in being able to protect yourself. As we continue to move on our journey, I wanted to bring forward a couple of the other dynamics that we still see in relationship to environmental racism and environmental injustice. Lots of times we've forgotten, about these restrictive covenances, these racial covenances that were in place in many locations across our country of you can't live in a certain community, so you get pushed to another community. So when we talk about sacrifice zones, we have to understand the policy that was used in many instances to help to be able to create those. And then, of course, we also understand redlining. And I thought I'd bring it on home to Boston, if that's all right with everybody, and just talk about how here, because lots of times we think those injustices must have only happened in the South. But we know that they were all across our country in both urban and rural communities. And if we don't make sure that we remember these, we don't have to get anchored to it, but we got to make sure that we're honoring that these impacts actually happened so that as we're moving forward, we don't make those same mistakes. And sometimes I know it's tough for folks. They're like, Mustafa, I'm really not trying to go back there. But for the folks who had to experience these types of situations and the ripples that move throughout history, it's important as we think about solutions to be able to get there. Now, as we've highlighted some of those injustices that have happened, I think that it's always important also to anchor ourselves in those who have been able to give us a North Star for those who have been able to say there is a better way and that we have an opportunity to work together to make real change happen. Margaret Mead is one of those individuals who's incredibly important, often forgotten. You know, and when she shared with us that it only takes a couple of us to begin the process and the journey of making positive change happen, if we can make sure that we're incorporating that and that we're doing it in an authentic, collaborative way, then we can make real change happen. Now, for those who often say, well, change can't happen, I'm like, well, yes, it can. And it happens in varying levels, but we continue to push. We continue to pull folks together. We continue to be together in solidarity. And the women's movement is one example. Now, yes, we still got a long way to go, and I'm sure sisters will agree with me that we have not yet reached that promised land that should be a part of the American dream. But we know that because of committed women and allies, that we began that journey. Now, we'll see what happens in 2 weeks. I promise I would not get political, but we still got some work to do. I want to also bring something else into this conversation that was a part of our lunch today with these amazing young leaders, and I see some of them in the room today. Youth have played such an incredible role in social justice movements across our country, and we often fail to remember or realize the roles that they have played, both in the women's suffrage movement and also in the civil rights movement, in the AIM movement, in the Chicano movement. A number of these movements were all strengthened by young people. Now, I come out of the environmental justice movement. In the environmental justice movement, we have an intergenerational movement. We honor the wisdom of our elders, but we also embrace the ingenuity and innovation of young people. When you can do that, you got something special there, because folks can't put those wedges in between you like folks often do. They look for the cracks. When they find the cracks, then they manipulate them, and in many instances, they slow processes down. Dr. King was a young man, but there was a lot of younger people who were a part of that civil rights movement. And then, of course, for those who are old enough to remember, or for those who are students of history, you know that the early environmental movement was driven by many, many young people. And out of that came the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and a number of these other landmark pieces of legislation that we all depend on for clean air and clean water. But I want to just make sure that we are honoring all those young people. This is the flashpoint of the environmental justice movement in Warren County, North Carolina. Now, there in Warren County, North Carolina, you see those young people who are laying there in that road. They're there because they're trying to block that trucks from coming in that were carrying PCBs. Those are cancer-causing chemicals. And young people and others were willing to do whatever they could to stop that. The studies that were done there showed that there were 7 other locations that were better suited for these cancer-causing chemicals that were going to a landfill, but they chose that black community over those other locations. And I just wanted to bring that in to our conversation today, along with all these young people who are playing such a critical role. I would be remiss if I did not call out the fact that the environmental justice movement is a matriarchal movement, a matriarchal-led movement. You see a couple of brothers out there, but it is actually these ladies and thousands upon thousands of others who have actually galvanized the movement and made sure that we continued in a positive direction. And it is our stories. We often, for those of us who come from science backgrounds, public health backgrounds, legal backgrounds, we're wedded to the words that are on the paper. This set of work is about people. The impacts and the sets of opportunities are there. I love this quote. How many folks are fans of James Baldwin? Raise your hand. If you have not yet read James Baldwin's work, you need to make sure that you run as quickly as possible and grab his work. Not only a great civil rights and social justice advocate, one of our greatest writers, and when he said, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you don't see. It is exactly that in our country, often we want to pretend that the impacts that are happening are not happening. We see today the misinformation and disinformation that is often infused into our psyche and into our culture in our country. And I love that James Baldwin tears that veneer off and shares that, yes, these impacts are happening and that we have a responsibility through our own humanity to address them. Let me ask a question. In the last 60 seconds, and you will hear me talk about seconds and minutes because I ran track in college and it is just a part of who I am. In the last 60 seconds, raise your right hand if you've taken a breath of air. Raise your hand if you've taken a breath of air. Let's find out. Everybody look around, find the non-air breathers. It looks like every person in here has taken a breath of air. You know, the interesting thing is that it's just an autonomic response. It's something that we do. We take it in and out, and we expect that there will be something positive coming into our body. The average person takes 22,000 breaths a day. In certain communities, you have 22,000 breaths of clean, pristine air that is doing positive things for your body. But in other communities, the communities that I come from and so many others, you're bringing in toxins. And sometimes people will say, well, you know, when I hear EPA talk or I hear some of the other state agencies talk, they're talking about parts per billion or parts per million. And we think, well, that's not that much. Until you start to put it in perspective, 22,000 breaths a day. And if you are taking in dioxins or you're taking in a number of the other types of chemicals that I'll talk about today, there's an impact that happens in your body. Now, I was talking with, again, the amazing students earlier, and we were talking about this particular set of information. 350,000 people dying prematurely in the United States of America each year. Do me a favor. Everybody take a deep breath. Hold it for a second. All right, let it out. I don't want to catch a case while I'm at Harvard. 350,000 people dying prematurely, many of them black and brown, indigenous, lower wealth, Asian, Pacific Islander. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. Let that sink in for a second. We know how serious that problem is, and that there's many things that we need to do to address that. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. And I know many of you know someone who's unfortunately had to deal with that situation. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from overdoses of drugs. All of those are critically important and that we have to stay laser focused on addressing those. But if more people are dying from air pollution than all these other things, then it seems like we should have an even stronger focus that our academic institutions should be building strong programs to address that particular need. And we should be pushing our sister organizations if our organizations are already on their journey. Here's why. How many folks in the room know someone who has asthma? Raise your hand. So that's almost everyone who's in this room. 24 to 25 million folks in our country have asthma. 7 million kids. Disproportionate is African American and Latinx children who are ones who are going to the emergency rooms and the ones who are losing their lives prematurely. We also know that those communities are underinsured or sometimes uninsured. So we have this dynamic that's going on. And then, of course, when COVID came, when you have these pre-existing medical conditions, it made you more vulnerable to COVID. Infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. So there's these cumulative impacts that continue to happen inside of our most vulnerable communities. This is the 48217. How many folks been to Detroit? How many folks been to 48217? 48217 is the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan. And when kids look out the windows of their homes, instead of seeing green space, what they see are facilities. They see flaring, all these types of things, and there are cancer clusters there and a number of these other locations. Now, sometimes people say, well, Mustafa, you know, this is that urban thing that's going on. I'm more of a rural person. So I always bring forward the fact of this study that talks about our national parks, one of the places that we often escape to be able to, you know, pull things together, to get closer to your higher power, to be able to revitalize, if you will. We now know that because we haven't been paying attention, what's been happening in our most vulnerable communities, that pollution is moving and it's having impacts on wildlife, It's having impacts on our parks and a number of other dynamics. And of course, the climate crisis is also beginning to exacerbate what's going on. This is the Manchester community in Houston, Texas. Now, this is a well-traveled audience. I get that. How many folks have been to Houston? I always love to see that. How many folks have been to the Ship Channel? All right, we got 3 people. What's wrong with the rest of y'all? Y'all don't like the Ship Channel? The Ship Channel. Manchester community, hardworking Latinx community, Latin community. And when you go there, I took some folks from the Obama administration, both the White House and EPA. And when they went there, they were like, Mustafa, something ain't quite right here. How many folks have, and I'll try 2 things. I'm gonna start on this side. How many people have an old car? Raise your hand if you have an old car. 1, 2. All right, you're in the middle. You'll help us to make this decision. How many people have an antique car? All right, so we old car people. Appreciate that, because I'm from the country, so I understand old cars. Do your cars, the windows roll down? They do. All right, can you come up? And I know I gotta go faster. I know I only have 20 minutes. All right, have a seat.
Oh, okay.
All right, here we go. So we're driving through Houston, and we're now making our way to the Manchester community. Could you put your hands on the wheel, please? Thank you. So when we get to the Manchester community, there's an interesting dynamic that happens with all those petrochemical facilities. So do you mind? Can you drive with one hand?
Yep.
Okay, can you roll the window down with the other hand?
Well, it'd be this side, yeah.
What kind of car you got? Okay. So as you move into the Manchester community, this hardworking Latinx community, and you roll the windows down in your car, you feel like you're breathing in gasoline fumes. This is the dynamic, and I want you to pay attention to that school and that track, and look at what's going on in the back. As far as the eye can see, in places like Cancer Alley and here in the Manchester community, children are being impacted, elders are being impacted, moms and dads are being impacted. And we find that the things, of course, that are coming out of that flaring and all of the different types of pollution that we're dealing with is also exacerbating what's going on with the climate crisis. And Hurricane Harvey came right through here. These are the dynamics that people are dealing with. Thank you. Give her a round of applause, because she can drive on both hands. This is what people are breathing every day. And it's only going to get worse and stronger as the climate crisis continues to grow. Now, for those of you who come from public health backgrounds, or those, I believe there were some folks who were tied to medical school and types of things, you know what happens with formaldehyde and benzene and arsenic and mercury and a number of these other dynamics. And this is what people are putting in their bodies each and every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when the hurricanes come, these companies push out even more pollution because it's a part of their startup shutdown process. All of this is tied to the climate crisis. And this is the diesel death zone in California. As these children are playing, they're breathing in the super high rates of cancer in this area. And all of that. So when I talk with folks and I share with you that you cannot win on the climate crisis if you don't win on environmental injustice, there's no way that you can do that if you don't address these impacts that have been going on for decade upon decade upon decade, not only in this country, but across the planet. Our indigenous brothers and sisters share with us that water is life. Flint, Michigan brought that forward for many people. Of course, there are other locations across the country. That's little Miss Flint. She's a little bit bigger now, but she's continued to fight. All of you know the impacts that happen to those babies because of their exposures to lead poison, the neurological impacts that happen. And when you have lead poisoning, there is a strong possibility that you will never end up in these seats unless there is a lot of work that is done to help you to be able to achieve that. But Flint, Michigan, as I used to share with folks, is just one example. There are 3,000 locations across our country that have higher levels of lead in the water than Flint, Michigan did. And you all understand how challenging that situation was. Benton Harbor, Michigan, much higher levels than Flint did. Jackson water crisis brought it back again for folks and saying that we have to pay attention to the impacts that are going on. We have to pay attention to the attacks that are currently happening on our water legislation and our air legislation. And if we don't, the folks will continue to whittle it away. Here's one that blew me away the first time I ever saw this. Of course, this is indigenous brothers and sisters who are fighting to stop some of the pipelines. 2.6 million miles of pipeline, fossil fuel pipeline in our country. That's enough to go to the moon and back, to the moon and back, to the moon and back, and on your way again to the moon. It doesn't make any sense to continue to build more and more pipeline. We can actually take some of the existing pipeline and begin to make the changes that are necessary to move forward on a clean economy. I always got to bring some of the artists that I've been blessed to work with or work in conjunction with into the conversation, because we often see just the craziness sometimes that some do, and I won't call out one in particular who's in the news a lot right now. But, you know, they have been willing to stand up and step forward. We had a conversation today at noon about some of those artists. Many of you know many of those amazing people who are there, who've been helping with the pipelines. I'm going to go just a little bit faster because I know we have some other things. It's not enough just to have clean water. You have to also have water that is affordable. And sometimes when we have privilege, and privilege is not necessarily a bad thing, it's what you do with your privilege and how you're using it to help others. You know, in many instances, there's an exponential growth that's happening. We also have a privatization of water that's going on, and that becomes extremely challenging. One, because it means that vulnerable communities have a much more difficult time in being able to pay those bills, but also we know that in many parts of our country, because of the climate crisis, because of the droughts, because of some of our policies we've had in place, that we have a shrinking supply of clean drinking water, of surface water. We could talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to bring that into the conversation because you got to make sure that things are affordable for folks. These are amazing students out of Atlanta who are making sure they're doing what they can to give back to their communities and helping to keep their water bodies clean, and also getting new skills and being able to do their own sets of water testing. So shout out to the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance. And Dr. Nataki Osborne jokes. We've got to also bring some of this into our conversation because the climate crisis is also going to exacerbate this situation. 10,000 tons of plastic entering our lakes each year. But there are other things that we can do. The other part is about 35 billion plastic bottles are being thrown away. I really appreciate the work that Jaden Smith is doing in the sense of bringing back forward paper for his water products that he's doing. And he's been donating a bunch of those to when we have these water crises. And then most folks have seen this before about that by 2050, we may end up having more plastic in our oceans than we do fish. We should all take that very serious. The fracking things that are going on as well. And then also, this is how much impact we currently have from our fracking processes. 72 trillion gallons of water is being impacted. I had to bring the Queen Bee into our conversations. We talked about her earlier. How many people love Beyonce? Raise your hand if you do. All right, you got some Beyonce haters, okay. I appreciate Beyonce because she uses her privilege, she uses her platform to help folks. So when Hurricane Harvey came through, she made sure that folks had food, that they had a number of things that they needed, and also that she helped to raise resources, especially for vulnerable communities. And we know that it's all too often now. All those things that we saw coming out of those pipes in those Black and brown and lower wealth communities is contributing to what we just went through with Hurricane Fiona, with the impacts that happened in Puerto Rico. I was there not too long ago. The impacts that are happening in Canada, and the impacts that are happening all across our country in urban and rural communities. And many times, folks can't just get up and leave before the storm happens. And sometimes we forget that. But there is a pathway forward. We know our new clean economy is going to give us an opportunity to be able to address many of these impacts that we see, to mitigate. You know, we're at a tipping point right now, but it's beginning to cost us huge amounts of money, but it's not too late yet. And I'm just going to go a little bit faster, so y'all bear with me. The new clean economy is going to create lots of opportunities. Through a just transition, we can help workers who have been working in the oil fields where I've been. We can help workers who were working in the coal mines and a number of other locations. And there are going to be even new sets of jobs that will be created. And that's why our academic institutions, and a number of others play such a critical role in helping to prepare the next generation of folks. I often share this story, and I shared it with some of the young leaders earlier about when I go to visit my mom in West Virginia and I drive through Western Maryland, you look up on those mountains and all of these gigantic windmills are there. And as soon as you go another 100 yards into West Virginia, you look up on the same mountains, there are no windmills that are there. Taking away opportunities, one for clean energy, but also for jobs. Sometimes when you're having a conversation about the climate crisis, one of the ways to have that in an effective way with certain people is to talk about economics, to talk about jobs. We hope everybody cares about lives, but everybody's got a different on-ramp. And this advanced manufacturing gives lots of places that have faded away an opportunity to come back. I bring this into the conversation because people always say, well, Mustafa, what does it look like when environmental justice truly becomes real? I would encourage you, when you get a chance, just Google the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. They took a $20,000 grant and leveraged over $300 million in changes, had all kinds of impacts that were happening in their communities, brownfield Superfund sites, impacts from bad transportation routes, lack of access to health care, jobs, and now they've been able to change that dynamic because the community decided what their vision was. They've now pulled together 144 partners, some from the academic, some from foundations, some from state and federal organizations, and all coming together to make change happen. And you'll be amazed at what can happen when we actually support frontline communities. There used to be, you see these houses on the side, these are old shotgun houses. For anybody from the South, you might know what shotgun houses are. If you come from the islands, we have another name. And those are 500 new green homes that were put in. Why is that important, Mustafa? Well, because folks were paying $300 to $400 a month for their electricity costs. When we got the new green homes in, down to $65 a month. So that's important for folks who are dealing with limited income situations. Also, through the new energy efficiency that are part of those, less greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. And they're building wealth, which is a big thing for me. And got 5 new healthcare centers. Before, seniors had to travel a half an hour to actually get to healthcare. Now we've got 5 new healthcare centers and a mobile healthcare unit that goes out to folks' homes who don't have access to transportation. Harold Mitchell there, and you saw Heather McTier-Toney also, right? Heather also played a role. They're also cleaning, we've cleaned up the brownfields and Superfund sites there, and they're putting in a new 35-acre solar farm, which will zero out people's electricity costs and also create more jobs for the folks who live there in the community. That's what this is about. That's how you revitalize communities, by making sure that communities have what they need to empower themselves. And then you got to make sure that the young people are part of the process. These young kids who go through the program there at the STEM school, when they start, some of them come from challenging backgrounds. Once they make it all the way through the program, there are engineers from BMW and a number of other engineering places who have come together to train these young kids. And I like being right here in the Boston, Cambridge area, because when these young kids go through, they create androids. They know everything there is about solar and wind turbines. When they get done, they have the same level of education as a first-year MIT student in relationship to this. And these are kids who come from challenging backgrounds. Give folks an opportunity, give them the support they need, can make change happen. The Clean Economy Coalition of Color is important because as we have these huge amounts of money that are now moving through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, through the IRA bill that you all have seen on TV and a number of these others, we have to make sure that the communities that have been disinvested in now have an opportunity to not just be at the seat at the table, but to be able to create their own businesses in this space. So we began this, and we've had thousands of folks who have gone through it. We've had lots of support from folks on Capitol Hill and state houses and a number of others. And I'm just going to quickly go through some of the new sets of opportunities. So when we talk about EVs are important, but we also have to talk about buses and scooters and a number of other things that for those of us who come out of the transportation equity space, want to make sure that the same amount of resources are going there as are going to the new electric cars that play a role, along with the charging stations. And then I have to bring forward also very, very quickly, when we're talking about worker training programs, we have to go to the ones that have had huge success. This is the Green Door Initiative out of Michigan. And they have a 96% placement rate. They have returning citizens, they have young people, and a number of others who go through Donnell Wilkins programs, and they also made some real changes when COVID hit. They turned on a dime and began to take in some new skill sets so that they still had folks who could move forward in a positive direction. And the tools to win on this new clean economy for me are very simple. You know, not only is it legislation, but it is also these other movements that folks would often said couldn't happen. I remember when the Women's March was being discussed, and I remember a bunch of men saying 1 million women would never come together. And sisters said, oh yeah. And of course, 1 million women did come together, but it wasn't just about the march, it was about the power that came out of that when they went back home. It was about folks saying that if I can't find someone who will represent me on Capitol Hill or in state houses or county commissions, I'll run for office myself. And you see all these amazing women who are now holding these positions and moving us forward. The People's Climate March was another one of those examples. And then here's the one that I really like, because I'm such a wonk, is the Science March. Because folks said that that scientists would never come out their lives, Union of Concerned Scientists, and they were wrong. Scientists did come out. They didn't have no rhythm, but they came out. And because of that, we began to look at science through a more equitable lens, if you will. We still got work to do, but when we come together, amazing things can happen. And it'll be remiss if I didn't bring forward all the amazing young people with the Green New Deal, and also This Is 0 Hour, whom pushed and shared some changes that we needed to give strong consideration to. And now you see many of those elements in some of the bills that have passed. Maybe looking a bit different, but their contribution was critically important. The Great American Outdoors Act, I wanted to bring that forward because we also have to be looking at natural solutions. Natural solutions play a critical role in helping us to address the climate crisis. And then, of course, coming up this year, we have the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which will also, because we know that we have right now a wildlife crisis. There are a number of studies out there that show that we might lose 1 million species over the next set of decades if we don't make the changes that are necessary. And of course, all of you are very familiar with the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment and those amazing scientists who have been sharing with us what's going on. I decided to bring Senator Booker into our conversation because in 2023, we have an opportunity to pass the Environmental Justice for All Act, which is incredibly important in making sure that vulnerable communities are even better protected, that they have the additional sets of opportunities to use Title VI from the Civil Rights Act, to increase some of the funding around public health research and a number of other things that I could go into. And we're almost there. And then, of course, you all are very familiar with Environmental Justice 40. 40% of federal benefits are now to be focused on vulnerable communities, where before that was not the case. But we've got to make sure there's real accountability in relationship to those dollars. I couldn't be on Harvard's campus and other campuses without also talking about divest and invest, and how there are now trillions of dollars that have been divested away from fossil fuels. I'll let y'all do with that what you do. And then, of course, also incredibly important is our vote. Our democracy demands our participation, although sometimes we don't. And that, if we want to win on all of these issues, we have to be able to know that our vote is protected and not suppressed, and that everyone is going to have a fair opportunity to participate in that process if they choose to. And in 2 weeks, we will have a better understanding of some of the things. This is one of the reasons that I do this work, is for the generations to come. I think many of you are also as equally focused on your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and those generations that will come. And we have an opportunity to make sure that they have a world. And then you can't have a presentation without also showing the place that is supposed to be the house of power for our country. But more importantly than that building is the individuals who stand in front of it and their engagement and hoping and pushing to make sure that there's real accountability. And I thought I would close with this. My grandmother says you have power unless you give it away. And I truly believe that. We often think, well, somebody else will take care of that. Or I'm busy, I just worked a double, and I don't have time to go to that. We often give little pieces of our power away, and it adds up to somebody else framing out the direction for our country. Gandhi had said in a gentle way, you can shake the world. And I truly believe that each and every one of us can. So with that being said, I am Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. I want to thank you all for a couple of minutes of your time.
I'm so grateful to be here. My name is Stephanie LeMenager, and I've got some wonderful audience questions that I'm going to combine with my own questions, Mr. Ali, so that we can kind of bring everybody into this conversation right away. One of the reasons that I'm really excited to see you here is I know there's a lot of hunger for environmental justice work and climate justice work on this campus, and that some people at least feel like we're not having enough conversation around those issues here. What do you think an institution like Harvard could do to really help prepare the wonderful students that you spoke with at lunch today? What do they need? What do they want? What are your suggestions from your own experience?
Well, we should, one, make sure that we're integrating environmental justice into the various programs that we have here and the degrees that folks are getting. You know, environmental justice touches everything. There's a strong economic component. So those who are in the business school should be understanding those sets of dynamics that are going on. You know, those are in the communication school. Also, that next generation of folks who are going to work in that space is going to be critically important. Of course, our science programs, making sure that students have what they need in that space. But it's not just inside of these walls. It is about authentically partnering with the organizations that are out there. There are some long-standing, amazing organizations who are here in this area, both in Boston and in Roxborough, who have decades upon decades of work and successes and challenges. So imagine if an institution like Harvard decides to fully back those folks out there who are doing the work. It's a game changer as long as you enter in that space. And I know that there is some support that has happened. But I'm one who believes that if we truly know and believe that the climate crisis is shrinking the clock each and every day, then we have to begin to make deeper sets of investments. So it is both inside, it is supporting those organizations inside of the university who are also working in that space with both resources and time and expertise, building out that curricula, and then also making sure that there are real, true sorts of relationships that are built with frontline organizations like ACE and a number of the others that I could call it. I shouldn't have called anybody out because if I forget somebody, they would get mad at me.
I just want to say there's a pretty wonderful video of you online talking about authentic collaboration too, and what that looks like and does not look like. So I recommend everybody take a look at that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to an audience question now. This is from an anonymous listener who says, what advice would you give to those of us working in local governments?
Well, you know, local government is actually where the rubber hits the road, no pun intended. We often do not properly resource our local governments and then get mad when they are not delivering what we need. Now, one, they have a responsibility to deliver if they have the resources that are necessary. So let me share this with y'all. So when we talk about environmental justice and this thankfully new focus that's there and people building out the infrastructure and capacity on the federal level, that's great. But those dollars and actions move to the states, to the counties, and to the local governments. And resources move from the states to the counties to the local governments. And usually by the time you get to the local governments, the states have taken their share, the counties have taken their share, and the local governments are left with what's left. So it makes it more difficult for them to build the capacity that's necessary, to build the environmental justice programs, to make sure that they have the folks who can help to make sure that whatever legislation is driving the particular areas, that they have what they need in that space. So that's why I think local governments are important. The other reason local governments are important, because in the environmental justice movement, we always say that communities speak for themselves, and all issues are local, right? Even though it may be a bigger, airshed or something else that's going on. So if we understand those dynamics, then we know where we can also put some pressure and also hopefully help to push to make sure resources are there and that there's accountability for those resources so they actually make it to the communities that need them the most.
Terrific. I'm going to combine two questions here, one from an Iris Lee, who's in our audience, and another from an anonymous person. What are the top 3 things that you would recommend we all take to address these issues, and maybe particularly actions by young people?
Well, the first thing that I always tell everyone is to get involved, get engaged. Frontline organizations, if you do it authentically, you'll be welcomed into that space. And what I mean by that is that don't do drive-bys, don't do parachutes in, actually spend real time with folks. Listen to what they are sharing is their vision. Listen to the challenges that are going on. It may not be a part of your normal reality. You have to actually, spend the time to hear what's going on. And then figure out, my grandmother is and was so amazing. She said everyone has blessings. Everybody literally has a blessing, sometimes multiple blessings. And when you bring those into a situation, you can help folks to be able to achieve the goals that they say that they're focused on. So that's one. Second part, for young people, and they heard me tell them about this earlier, get engaged in the political process. You don't have to wait for somebody else to be your representative. Yeah, sometimes there's some age cutoffs for certain offices and those types of things, but give strong consideration to get engaged. I don't tell anybody what party you should be a part of or any of those types of things. I hope you'll be a part of a party that actually cares about people and making positive change happen. But that's another one. The other thing that I share with younger people is to really have an understanding about your dollars. And because you're going to have a longer runway than some of us, so what you do with your resources and how you pool your resources is going to be critically important. And we often don't think, I used to do some stuff in the fashion world, and we often don't think about, before we purchase something, about the impacts that were in that space. So lots of times we don't think about our dollars. So I often tell folks, have a better understanding of that. And then if I had a fourth one, it would be, creating your own entity or becoming an entrepreneur, which I think is incredibly important because you have then the ability to frame out what that organization looks like, what your values are, those types of things. It's not going to be for everybody, but those are some of the things that I suggest.
That's great. And I would also just point everybody to Revitalization Strategies, an entity that you created, and we could maybe talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah.
I have a question that I think, again, is going to combine some different folks out there. Lots of grief right now,
Yeah.
and historically, democracy grief. Do we have one? Did we ever have one? Climate grief. How do you find hope?
I find hope in lots of places. I find hope from the young people that I work with all across the planet. Because I see something special, and I know they're going to, continue to push, but I don't expect young people to carry the burden by themselves. I get hope from my elders, some of the folks who were in the civil rights movement, sometimes now they're 80 years old, 90 years young, 80 years young, and they still have that twinkle in their eye. Imagine that, all the things that folks have seen coming out of some of those movements and still believing. And still knowing that there is a better path forward. So I get a lot from there. I get it from nature. I'm a runner and I write poetry. So spending time around creatives is incredibly important. I find it in lots of different places. By no means do I not also understand the challenges that we have in front of us. But I've learned and listened from so many folks of great challenges that others have been able to navigate. And I truly believe that if we all work together, that we can find a way to mitigate many of the things that are going on. But we can't be silent. We can't wait for somebody else. So that's the way I do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say that your talks are one of the few places I can go to find a little recharge. It's a lot of despair among my own student body in Oregon at this point in time, although a lot of creativity and brilliance as well. From another anonymous person, the COVID crisis seems like a missed opportunity for rethinking and recharging commitment to environmental progress, and we might also say to various social justice issues. Can you frame COVID in a way that kind of moves us forward towards transformation?
Well, COVID put another spotlight on the breaks and tears and gaps that exist inside of our social safety net. It also put a spotlight on the fact that vulnerable individuals, frontline individuals, continue to carry a lot of weight for the country, and also the ones that had to deal with, the impacts that came from, from the pandemic, from the virus. It also gave us an opportunity to think critically. It was amazing how many people called me when things were starting to kick off, because I tie what happened with COVID. So we know that we have a food crisis that we're going to have to deal with, especially if we don't mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis. So it gives us an opportunity to rethink how we deal with food justice issues. Where does our food come from? How do we make sure that we are supporting more locally grown? How do we make sure that we're supporting the groups that are coming together? It also showed us that we have a medical crisis. It began to spotlight, if you will, or highlight the fact that we've had a number of clinics and hospitals that have closed, both in the rural context and in urban centers as well. And then it also highlighted the fact that, there are biases in our medical system in relationship to folks of color. So it kind of re-put that spotlight, and in a number of other ways too, I know we don't have time to unpack all that, to begin to think about systems change, to begin to think about how do we better invest in infrastructure. What does 21st century infrastructure look like that helps us be a bridge toward the 22nd century? In the way and where we invest and build, and a number of these other dynamics. It gave us an opportunity, y'all gonna get me going here in a second, about our schools and who and where we invest, and thinking critically about the changes that are going to need to happen. So for me, even though it was challenging, my family lost the first person to die in West Virginia. It also gave an opportunity to rethink a number of things. And I've seen some changes, but you would think with something that took so many lives that there would have been even more change. It's the work that we still have to do.
Yeah, I love the idea of thinking about a kind of reparative infrastructure,
Yeah.
Another terrific question from David Kaiser in our audience. How does a trauma-informed approach to environmental justice change our perspective?
I believe in real talk. So by sharing the impacts that are going on, for some folks, it's important for them to actually be able to see that there are places in our country. There are places in our country you can go where folks don't have indoor plumbing, where they don't have clean water to drink, where they don't have access to fresh and healthy food. If you go to, how many folks in the room have ever spent any time on a reservation? Well, just a couple of people, right? When you go to see the conditions that some indigenous brothers and sisters and family live in, it's mind-boggling that in our country in 2022, that folks don't have basic amenities, that folks sometimes have to travel 40, 50 miles to be able to go get some water, to be able to bring it back to the places that they live, to deal with the things that you need to be able to take care of. I bring all that into the space of, in this moment, this transformational moment, that we can begin to heal our country and heal our communities.
This could be a question that goes on way too long, but I'm going to try to keep it short and make it useful for you. What's your journey? And maybe you could talk about a couple of, I'm going to say educational experiences. I know those don't all happen in the classroom.
Yeah.
How did you become you?
I'll take no credit for this, besides the tie that I have on that my mama loves. Hi, Mom. It all goes back to my family and the people who helped raise me. You know, my grandfather was an amazing, amazing man. I was sharing with some of the students earlier that my grandfather was a coal miner and my grandfather was a farmer at the same time. So when he was done working in the mines, he was working on his small farm. And he was one of those individuals that was focused on workers' rights and civil rights. And he wasn't a boisterous person, but people would come from counties around to sit on his porch and to talk about how to improve situations. And he used to have a bushel of apples. And he was one of those people, have you ever seen the individual can cut the apple without it breaking and take the whole thing off? And then I don't know how he did it. After he did that, he did this thing with his thumb and he would be able to slice the apples with his little knife. And I would sit right here next to him. And he would cut a little piece off. And as he was talking with the men and as they were strategizing on different things to move forward in a positive direction, he would cut a little piece off and give it to me. And I didn't have a psychology background at that time, so I didn't know it was operant conditioning and some of the other things that were going on. But he was sharing with me the lessons that were necessary about how to be patient, how to listen, how to make sure that you're bringing other people together, even if they had a different view about something, and how you find a way to come together on some commonalities and steps forward. That was one of my lessons. My dad gave me lessons of working hard and not giving up. And I'm very thankful to them. And I started working on social justice issues when I was 16. And I have to give a shout out and credit to the early environmental justice leaders who mentored me, protected me, probably a couple times scolded me. Hazel Johnson, mother of the environmental justice movement. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be sitting here on this stage today. She used to call me the kid. And in the early days of the environmental justice movement, a lot of the strategy actually happened in the lobbies of hotels. So they would all meet and Hazel would say, come over here, sit here and listen. And I remember back to sitting and listening from my grandfather and taking in. So I'm thankful to Hazel. Also, there wouldn't be a gentleman by the name of Barack Obama if it wasn't for Hazel Johnson. And I'm glad we're recording this because Hazel was the one who gave Barack his pass to actually be able to be that individual in Chicago when he was in his early days. So you have to have those types of folks who are willing to invest in young people and to be patient with you. So those are my educational lessons. I learned lots of great stuff, in the classroom, but in the real world, everybody knows there's a whole different set of things that are going on. And if you do it with authenticity, then you're heading in the right direction. And I just had great folks like Dan Smith, one of our greatest organizers, who I learned so much from, and so many others.
Those are really powerful stories. I think mentorship doesn't get quite as much play as it ought to. It's so important. How are we doing on time? Okay, well, I have one more question that I'm going to ask, and it's drawing from a couple of audience questions. I'll try to phrase it well. Sometimes there are really powerful platforms that social movements bring out, and then maybe months, years, decades later, something actually happens in federal policy or maybe state policy that reflects some of that. But there are all sorts of compromises that have been made. Mm-hmm. How do you work both emotionally and maybe politically with the distance between the kind of rawness of social movement aspiration and need and then the compromised institutional kind of results that we often see? Yeah,
well, for folks who come from the front lines, they're dealing with life and death situations in many instances. So there is an immediacy that is needed to help to protect people's lives. So you have to honor that and respect that. Mm-hmm. Many of the leaders also have understood the long game, and creating wins along that journey. You know, for those folks of us who've come out of the environmental justice movement, we've known that it takes decades in many instances to be able to get some of the wins that are necessary. We still got a long way to go. So my balance is understanding where we're trying to get to and what are the steps that are a part of that, and then also understanding what do we need to do with options A, B, and C, because you got to have a couple of different ones, because things can go, you know, they can go left real quick to be able to make that happen. And when you see successes in movements, they have to have that. And you're now finally seeing a small harvest coming in, but we still got some real significant challenges in front of us. So it is understanding the immediacy of the moment and doing what you can in that moment, but also having those steps and actions that are going to be necessary for decades to come. You know, a good friend of mine, we were having a conversation, and we were talking about the liberation and freedom of Black people in this country, and how, you know, 400 years passes, and, you know, we've made some advances, but there are lots of things that we still haven't been able to truly have justice about. And we look at many of the movements, and there have been some successes, but there's still lots of work that needs to happen. And that's why you have to build authentic allies to be there with you as you're moving forward.
Thank you so much. Can we all thank Mustafa Santiago Ali for being here?
And I would like to conclude the program by saying thank you to Mustafa for an inspiring talk and conversation. And thank you to Stephanie for being such a terrific interlocutor. I also want to thank the audience for being with us today, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Take care.